Hey, I'm Tashi, and welcome to my home. In this first episode of our beginner crochet series, we're going to be talking about 5 things that you should probably know before you even pick up a crochet hook. Before we get started, if you like any part of this video, please consider giving it one of these, and if you're not already subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. This is just the first of a series of beginner crochet videos that I'll be releasing on my YouTube channel, so you'll want to make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss an episode. Right, Kevin?
Right, Kevin?
Let's get started.
I love yarn. I love yarn. I love yarn. I love yarn.
The first thing that we want to talk about before we dive into all of the nitty-gritty details of the tools and the yarn is we want to clarify the difference between knitting and crochet. Because chances are that if you're crocheting in public, somebody will say to you, "What are you knitting?" And you need to have the knowledge in order to be able to calmly and gently explain to them the difference between crochet and knitting, even though internally you will be raging. Okay, so here's the difference. These are knitting needles. When you're knitting, you have 2 needles, is what they're called, 2 needles that you're working with. Sometimes they're attached with a cord like this, sometimes they're not. It just kind of depends on the project that you're working on. So this is knitting, when you're working with 2 needles at a time. Crochet is when you're only working with one, what we call a hook. Kevin loves crochet. Crochet uses a hook, and all of their crochet hooks, they're called a hook because they have this little hook on the end, on the end of the hook. That's why they're called a hook. You can have that one. There you go. So that's the big difference between knitting and crochet, is that knitting uses 2 needles, whereas crochet just uses 1 hook. The other big difference between knitting and crochet is that knitting can actually Knitting can actually be done on a machine, whereas crochet cannot. Because crochet kind of creates knots with the different types of stitches that are created, there's no machine out there yet that can recreate actual crochet. So if you ever see an item in a store that's labeled as like crochet, either one, it's actually knitting made to mimic the look of crochet, or 2, it was probably made by hand and somebody is probably getting severely underpaid to make that garment. So it's always better to just hand make your clothes, not buy them from big department stores, etc., etc. Support small business. And then the final thing to know about the difference between knitting and crochet is that knitting does use less yarn. Because of the style and the way that their stitches are put together in knitting, it eats up less yarn than crochet does, because crochet tends to have thicker stitches versus knitting. So that's why crochet uses a little bit more yarn. So those are like the key differences between crochet and knitting. So now if anybody says to you, "Oh, are you knitting?" when you're in public, you can calmly explain to them the differences between knitting and what you are doing. The next thing that we need to talk about is size. There are 2 different categories of size that we're going to get into, and the first is size of your hooks. Crochet hooks come in all different sizes. When we talk about size, we're talking about how big the hook is on the end of the crochet hook. The bigger the size, the bigger your stitch is going to be. The smaller the size, the smaller your stitch is going to be. And the thing that you want to keep in mind is that you're going to use different sized hooks for different types of yarn and for different types of projects. She really wants to crochet today, guys. I don't know. Hooks range in sizes. There's names for all of the different sizes. The smallest hook size I currently own is a 0.6 millimeter, whereas the largest crochet hook that I currently own is a 25 millimeter. Okay, so you can see there is a huge difference in the size of each of these crochet hooks, and they would be used for entirely different projects. The smaller hooks are usually used for making really delicate lace items, or like this one, you could even honestly literally crochet thread with that hook because it's so small. Whereas this one, you would want to use it with a very, very thick yarn, maybe if you're making a blanket or a sweater or something like that. So when you're looking for different hook sizes, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look on usually the bottom of the crochet hook. It'll tell you what size of a hook it is. So you might see it written in millimeters like this, or you may also see it etched into the hook itself. So if we take a look at these 2 hooks, you're going to notice that the top hook says B-2.0 millimeters and the bottom hook says J 6.0 millimeters. So hooks are named in a couple of different ways. First of all, some of them have letters that come before them, whereas some of them have numbers that come before them. For example, this hook is a 7-4.5 millimeter. These are just different ways that you can refer to the sizes of the hooks. I personally typically refer to hook sizes by the millimeter size, so you might see it different ways. Different people have different preferences. If you're ever reading a pattern, you might see it labeled in millimeters, or you might see it with the letter or number. It just kind of depends on the person and kind of what they're used to, but just know that if you have somebody say you need a B hook, that also means 2.millimeter. So you just kind of keep that in mind, and most hooks that you will find in the store are labeled with both their millimeter and their letter or number label. Now we have to talk about yarn size, and I have a bunch of yarn sitting in front of me that I'm going to kind of show you examples of. So yarn is classified based on how thick each strand of yarn is. So yarn starts at a size 1 yarn, which is a super thin yarn that is called super fine yarn. Now, the annoying part about this is that each of these different types of yarn also has like 3 other names that people refer to it as. So size 1 yarn is often also referred to as fingering or sock weight yarn or baby yarn, stuff like that. I actually don't even own any, so I can't even show you the size of that yarn because I don't like working with super fine yarn. The next size up would be a size 2, and size 2 is a lot of times referred to as sport weight yarn. So you'll see it right there. You can see this is kind of a thin strand of yarn. Here's another example of a sport weight yarn. If you just look at the strands, they are fairly thin, and I will show you a comparison of this next to a larger yarn. This sometimes is also referred to as baby yarn, which is kind of confusing because size 1 and size 2 can both be referred to as baby yarn. Then we've got size 3, which is also referred to as light yarn. Now, a lot of times when you buy yarn from the store, if you just look on the back, you look for a little yarn ball and you'll see the number written in it, and that's how you can tell what size of yarn that it is. Size 3 is often also referred to as DK or lightweight yarn. Then we have size 4 yarn. Size 4 yarn is definitely the most typical size of yarn. When you go to like Walmart or Hobby Lobby or Joann's and you're looking and you see yarn kind of like this, it's a size 4. So again, if you look on the back, you'll see that little yarn ball and it'll say size 4. Size 4 yarn is known by a few different names. You have Aran, worsted weight is what you'll hear a lot of people refer to it as, and then also some people refer to it as Afghan. So this is definitely the most common type of yarn, and it comes in lots of different colors. The next step up is a size 5. Size 5 is known as bulky yarn, and this is an example of a velvet bulky yarn. So again, this is what the little ball will look like. So bulky yarn is also most commonly referred to as chunky yarn. So bulky or chunky. And if you guys look at the strand of this one compared to the strand of our size 2, you can really see the difference. So you can see that the size 5 is significantly thicker of a strand of yarn than the size 2. Then we have size 6, which is also referred to as super bulky yarn. So it might look something like this. They also have a size 7 yarn, which is a jumbo yarn, and I actually don't have any jumbo yarn to show you, but what a lot of people will do is they will hold a couple strands of, like a size 5 together and crocheted with 2 strands at the same time in order to create that kind of jumbo yarn effect. So now that we know a little bit about the different hook sizes and the different types of yarn, let's kind of mesh these two together and see how they intertwine. So based on the type of yarn that you choose to work with, you're going to want to use a different size crochet hook. So obviously, if you're working with a smaller size yarn, you're going to want to use a smaller crochet hook. Whereas if you're working with a larger size yarn, you're going to want to use a larger crochet hook. If you look on the actual instructions on the back of the yarn, we talked about how you're going to see the size of the yarn, but right next to that, you should also see the size hook that they recommend you use with this yarn. Now, this is obviously just a recommendation. It's not a hard and fast rule. So for this size 4 acrylic yarn from Joann Fabrics, it recommends a size 8 H or 8 5mm crochet hook. If you use a 5mm crochet hook, that's perfectly fine. Depending on the type of project that you're doing, you might want to go up in size or down in size. What happens is when you increase the size of the hook that you're using, it's going to make your stitches bigger and more spaced out. So your work is going to end up bigger and it might end up with like some gaps in it. So if that's the style that you're going for, then you might want to use a bigger hook. Whereas reverse of that, if you use a smaller size hook, it's going to make your stitches closer and tighter together, and so your overall project will end up a little bit smaller. So it really just depends on what you're making and kind of the style that you're going for with whatever it is you're crocheting, but also your personal preference. I don't know why, but I am obsessed with the 4.5mm crochet hook. I use it for almost everything. It's like the first hook that I go to. There's just something about it that I love. The more that you guys crochet, the more that you will realize that you kind of tend to gravitate towards a specific size of hook. I know that sounds like really weird, but I guarantee it's gonna happen to you. Typically, the bulky yarn recommends that you use a larger hook, like an 8mm, 9mm, 10mm, something like that. However, Amigurumi typically recommends that you look at the size hook that the yarn recommends you use. So this one recommends an 8mm, and then you go 2 sizes down from that. So if I were going to make an animal with this yarn, I would want to use a 6mm crochet hook instead of an 8mm. And the reason why is because with those stuffed animals, since you are stuffing them with stuffing, you don't want the stuffing to come out, so you want to make sure that your stitches are really small, really tight, and really close together. So now that we've talked about sizing, now we have to talk about different types of yarn. So while there's different sizes of yarn, there's also different materials that your yarn is made out of, and different types of material are better used for different types of projects. So we're going to start with the most common, which is acrylic yarn. This is typically the types of yarn that you will find when you go to any big department store and you see that they're selling yarn. Acrylic yarn is used for a lot of projects, and honestly, acrylic yarn is really user preference. I like to use acrylic yarn when I'm making sweaters to be worn in the winter because acrylic yarn does tend to keep you fairly warm. Sometimes though, acrylic yarn can get itchy. So you just want to make sure that you touch your acrylic yarn before you go making any garments with it, because if you're going to have it rubbing on your body, you want to make sure that it's got a nice feel to it. Acrylic yarn is also often used to make blankets. So when you see those big, beautiful blankets that maybe your grandma or your mother has made, it's probably been done with acrylic yarn. Then we also have cotton yarn, which is one of my favorite yarns. I love the feel of cotton yarns, and it comes in different weights. So this is a sport weight cotton yarn. Remember that size 2. And when I say weight, I'm just referring to the size of the yarn. So that's your first little crochet term to know. Weight just means size of the yarn. So a size 2 weight versus a size 4 weight cotton yarn feels very different. The lighter weight yarns, they feel a lot softer than when you start to get heavier weight yarns. You might also encounter some combination. This is a combination cotton and bamboo yarn, which is also super soft and that I absolutely love. Cotton yarns are best used for summer wearables. So if you're making a garment or a hat that you plan to have people or yourself wearing in the summer, you want to use some type of natural fiber because it helps kind of keep you cool and it helps wick moisture away. So by natural fiber, I mean cotton, bamboo, hemp, anything that can be found naturally in nature is what makes it a natural fiber. Now, velvet yarn I would not recommend for beginner use because of the texture, it does tend to be very slippery. So if you're still working on trying to get used to like working with yarn and getting used to the different types of stitches, acrylic yarn is really the best beginner yarn to start with because it's very easy to see your stitches, it's really easy to handle and to work with. But velvet yarn can be used to make a lot of really fun things. I mean, literally just think of anything that you would want to be made in velvet and you can make it with velvet yarn. I personally use velvet yarn to make scrunchies because velvet scrunchies are fire. And then we get into some of the other bulky and super bulky yarns that are fuzzy like this one. Now these types of yarns can be used to create lots of things as well. You can of course create clothing with these if you want to. It would just be a very fluffy, very soft sweater, and I have done that before. I love winter sweaters and cardigans that are made with bulky yarn because they're just so cozy. You just want to curl up by the fire in them. They're really fun. But just keep in mind, bulky yarn is expensive. So if you end up making a garment or if you want to make a blanket with bulky yarn, it's going to cost you a fair bit of money because one of these is not going to make you a blanket. It's not even going to make you a baby blanket, my friends. And this, I believe this was around like, I want to say $13 just for this guy. And you would probably need at least 3 of them to make a baby blanket. So just keep that in mind. If you're thinking about making a blanket with bulky yarn or some sort of garment, it is going to cost you a little bit more money than if you were to just use regular acrylic yarn. Bulky yarn is also used to make amigurumi, and amigurumi are those stuffed animals that you see that people crochet. They're super cute, they're really fun and easy to whip up once you understand how to do it and how to make the crochet stitches, which by the end of my beginner series, you will have all of the tools and knowledge necessary in order to make your own amigurumi. So that's another thing that bulky yarn and super bulky yarn is really great for, is making those little stuffed animals. Now that we know about what all of the different types of yarn can be used for, we now need to talk about some crochet terms that you're gonna wanna make sure you know so that you can understand what the crochet community is talking about. First of all, if you're kind of looking around on social media, you might hear people referring to a whip. WIP, whip. A whip is an acronym for a work in progress. That's what it stands for. So if you're in the midst of working on a project, it's called your whip. You might also hear the word frog. Frog, in reference to a project, means ripping it out. So let's say I'm making a sweater and I try it on and it ends up not fitting quite right in a certain area. Then maybe I say to my friend, oh yeah, I had to frog my sweater. That means I had to like undo it in order to fix the error that I made. And the term frog, nobody really knows where it came from, but it's thought that it comes from, you know, because you're ripping out your work. Rip it, rip it, rip it, rip it. Sounds like ribbit, 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 like what a frog makes. So then people just started calling it frogging, or you frog your work. I don't know. This is just what I read on the interwebs, okay? Another term that you're gonna wanna be familiar with is gauge. So if you start working off of crochet patterns, you might see a section that talks about the gauge. So a gauge is just a guide that you can use to make sure you are crocheting the same size as the person that created the pattern. So we would use a gauge, and usually it's just like a square that's 4 by 4 inches. You would crochet a square that's 4 by 4 inches, and you would count how many stitches across and how many rows up it took you to create that 4 by 4 square, and then you would kind of be able to adjust your hook size or your yarn size based on if your gauge was smaller or larger than the pattern. That's a little bit complicated and a little more advanced, but for now I just want you to be aware of kind of what a gauge is and what it's used for. It's just to make sure that your crocheted piece is going to end up as the same size as the pattern that you're following. Another term that you're going to hear in reference to the actual yarn is skein and cake. So the difference here is this is a skein. It's when it's in kind of like a long form, or even something like this where it's all twisted up. This is also known as a skein of yarn. A cake is when you take a skein of yarn like this and you turn it into a ball like this. This is a cake. So you see how the cake is flat? It looks like a round cake. Okay, that's the difference between a skein and a cake. Most yarns that you're going to buy at like the big stores are going to be already in skein form for you. If you go to specialty yarn stores, like small mom and pop yarn stores, typically they sell in these skeins. So I bought both of these skeins from my local yarn store. And then I already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, remember when you hear the word weight, we're not talking about how heavy your project is. We're just talking about what size your yarn is that you're using. And those are the key terms that you're gonna wanna know just to get you started. So the last thing that I want you guys to know before you pick up a crochet hook is I want you to know a little bit about some of the tools that you might need to use when you're crocheting. So we'll talk first about, because I have it in my lap, the ball winder. Now, you're not gonna need to use this unless you are shopping from your local store and you're getting skeins that are twisted like this. What a ball winder is used for is it's used to turn your skeins of yarn into cakes of yarn. So it winds it up into a nice little cake for you. Hand in hand with your ball winder, you may also want to purchase what's called a swift. It looks like this. And what you do is you just put your yarn skein around this piece here and it turns and helps your winder wind easier. Trust me, you really cannot use a winder without a swift. I tried, it was comical. My husband had to help me. That tool is a little bit more advanced. Like I said, you can get by totally fine as a beginner just buying these acrylic skeins from bigger department stores. These are a really great place to start and what I would recommend to any beginner. Some other things though that you're definitely going to want, you're obviously going to want at least one crochet hook to get you started. Just make sure, like we already talked about, you're choosing a crochet hook that matches the size of the yarn that you're utilizing. For most crochet projects, you're also going to want some sort of needle to weave in your ends. So at the end of every crochet project, you have to cut your yarn and then you're gonna have a little tail of yarn hanging off the end of your project. Well, you're gonna want a way to weave that into the rest of your work. So you're gonna want a needle, but you can't just use a typical sewing needle because they're too small. So you're gonna wanna get a bigger needle, and they come in plastic or metal. And some of them actually have a curved end as well. I don't have any of those ones personally, but it's kind of up to you and your preference. Some people prefer plastic, some people prefer metal. For me, I kind of use both depending on what type of project I'm working on. So I have both. You also may want to purchase stitch markers. So stitch markers are basically just like plastic safety pins that you can clip onto your work. These help in a variety of ways. If you're making amigurumi, these are super helpful because amigurumi is worked in a circular pattern, and so it's helpful to use a stitch marker to mark the start of your circle so you know when you get back to the beginning. You can also use it to help you with counting if you're counting different rows or something like that. I've done it where maybe I had to do 5 rows. I would put 5 stitch markers in my hand, and every row I finished, I would put a stitch marker on the end of that row, and then I knew when I ran out of stitch markers, that was the end of my 5th row. So they're honestly kind of handy and they're super cheap. You can get like a big bulk order of stitch markers from Amazon for like $5. I mean, super, super cheap, and in my opinion, definitely worth it. Finally, the last tool that you're 100% gonna need is a pair of scissors, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy like these little guys, although I do love these. There are so many different types of yarn scissors. So that's one style. This is another style that you'll see a lot. These are really nice for travel because they do have a cap that goes on it. I just don't know where my cap is right now. It got lost somewhere. Kevin, what'd you do with my cap? Did you eat it? So you'll want a pair of scissors, but it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can just use regular scissors and that's totally fine. But if you do plan to travel with your crochet, some sort of travel case is really nice. I will have this exact product linked in the description below. This is like the first crochet case that I bought, and it came with everything I needed. It came with a variety of hook sizes, with needles, with stitch markers, scissors. I absolutely love this thing, and I have been using it for years and years. You could also just buy a cute little travel case like this, and then whenever you need to grab and take your crochet on the go, you have it all ready to go for you. Well, that's all the tips that I have for you guys today of things that you should know before you start crocheting. Let me know if you guys think that I missed anything by commenting down below, and let me know what other types of tips and tricks you'd like to know about in our next beginner crochet series video. I'll see you guys next time for another beginning crochet adventure information. inspirational video. Right, Kevin? Say bye to the people. We love you. We'll see you next time. Bye. We need to clip your nails, dude. They are very long. Oh, she got some claws. All right, we got to clean up this mess. It's ridiculous.